It's one of the absolute most complex things I've heard in this format. Steve Wilson paints your ceilings and walls with Yes. It's big, it's open. It's probably the best this album has ever sounded. Hello, my name is Ian, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So today, the date of recording this episode is Monday, March 17th, 2025. In other words, St. Patrick's Day. And for St. Patrick's Day, I'm wearing green. This is Close to the Edge, the Super Deluxe Edition from Yes and Rhino Records. When I think of great progressive rock albums from the year 1972, the first two that spring to mind are perhaps Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull and Yes's Close to the Edge. I feel these, along with a record like Foxtrot by Genesis, as emblematic of everything that was great about that genre at its height. This was Yes, coming off the success of Fragile, and starting to really come into their own as performers and composers, with John Anderson on vocals, Steve Howe on guitar, Chris Squire on bass, Rick Wakeman on keys, and soon to depart for King Crimson was Bill Bruford on drums. Of course, several of them sang, John Anderson, Howe, and Squire. So in addition to their prowess as instrumentalists, one of the big signatures of Yes was their elaborate vocal harmonies, which to my ear recall American artists like Simon and Garfunkel, or even Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. So what can I say about this album that hasn't already been said? If Thick as a Brick is Prog's Monty Python, a skewering satire of some of the excesses of that genre, then this album is like Prog Church. To me, this is a spiritual and transcendent experience. Sure, that may sound pretentious, which is a word that I hate to use, but as somebody who doesn't really have a particular faith, music is my religion. As Frank Zappa once said, music is the only religion to deliver the goods. And if you don't see God within that middle section of Close to the Edge, the title track, where Rick Wakeman is wailing on that church organ, you probably never will. There is nothing on this album but three standout tracks. You have Close to the Edge, which occupies the entirety of side one of the original vinyl LP, which is included here. Not an original, but a repress. You have And You and I, which is this unfolding journey, which takes up half of side two. And finally, you have Siberian Khatru, which is the final track on the album, and a barn burner of a concert opener. These tracks are, of course, quite long-winded. They're involved. But the thing that makes the title track in particular my favorite progressive rock epic ever is that the structure of it is remarkably similar to a normal intro, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, outro pop format. What's groundbreaking about it is that 4-minute form is expanded to some 18 minutes and change. And there's something about this that makes this 18 minutes and change endlessly re-listenable and accessible, and it never feels the weight of its length. If we're talking about least favorite songs, maybe Siberian Khatru is my least favorite, but it's got the best riff on the album, and it's got some of Steve Howe's best work as well as a guitarist. What this album ultimately represents to me is a band coming together and playing from the strengths of the individual to the benefit of the whole, the larger picture. While Fragile, with its various solo excursions, can come across a bit disjointed and maybe even a little bit showboaty at times. This one has everyone playing to the strengths of the ensemble. Many of Chris Squire's bass riffs in the opening movements of Close to the Edge are every bit as soloistic and impressive as his Fish composition from Fragile. But here it becomes the groove the entire section is based on. He weaves in and out, but he never steps outside of the composition. It's certainly an album that is deserving of this lavish treatment. And Steven Wilson's 5.1 surround mixes have been out of print for some time, so in my opinion, it was deserving of a reissue. This is the kind of album and mix that deserves to be in print, and it deserves to be heard by as many people as possible. The fact of the matter is I didn't always love Close to the Edge. And the first version I owned was the 2003 remaster. I always found it very harsh and grating, and it seriously affected my enjoyment of the album. It wasn't until I picked up Steven Wilson's 2013 mix, which at the time was very hard to get a hold of, as all of the Wilson mixes were rapidly falling out of print. But it really opened me to the grandeur of this album. He made it sound clear, dynamic, and uncluttered. He made it sound aggressive when it needed to, and beautiful when the material called for it. So even though I already had Wilson's 5.1 mix of this album, in the meantime, I have collected the other two titles in this Rhino Super Deluxe series, the Yes album and Fragile. And I was certainly anticipating a similar reissue of Close to the Edge to join its siblings. Sure enough, I wasn't disappointed. And this release came sooner than I thought it would. This is less than a year from the release of Fragile last June, which I did review on the channel, and I loved it. So as somebody who doesn't have an exhaustive Yes collection, and I have to admit that my Yes collection is mostly these deluxe box sets, the lure of a complete live show was certainly enticing. I didn't already have any live material from Yes, not even Yes songs, and certainly not the very expensive Progeny set, which when it came out, I didn't have the opportunity to get. I think I was still in college and didn't really have much of an income. And that's kind of a little bit in depth for somebody who's really a latecomer to the band. So I felt that this release, which contains the Live at the Rainbow show, was a no-brainer. Like I had to get this. Of course, these Rhino sets that I've mentioned, the Yes album, Fragile, and indeed Close to the Edge, are far from perfect. And in my opinion, they suffer from quality control issues. Take last year's Fragile set, for instance, which had a supposed lost outtake that ended up being from another artist, The Dean by Terry Reid. That said, the packaging style is super appealing to me. It's LP-sized, allowing you to gain the vintage feeling tactile experience while enjoying crystal clear digital audio. And my apologies to vinyl purists, but I'm a digital man, to quote one of my favorite Rush songs. That being said, I did used to own Close to the Edge on vinyl, and indeed CD, as I mentioned before, because the cover art always blew me away, particularly the inside. Roger Dean's work is nothing short of outstanding, and when I met him a few years ago, he was a very genuine and warm guy to speak to, although he did tease me for liking Yes. As the Wilson Yes mixes have not been in print, basically until these Rhino reissues have come out, I'm more or less forced to buy them as they come out, just like the old days. So I genuinely struggle to see these sets as a cash grab, as many fans on the internet have accused them of being, time and time again, to the point where it just starts to burn me out seeing those words. As I previously stated, these Rhino mixes are essentially bringing the Wilson Yes remixes back into print for the first time in about a decade. I was able to get the previous edition of Close to the Edge, of course, and the Yes album, but the others have eluded me and are actually every bit as expensive secondhand as these deluxe sets are. So with that in mind, I genuinely struggle to see these sets as a cash grab, as many of the fans accuse them of being. I mean, to some extent, of course they are, but as somebody who used to own this album in several different formats, but when I started my business, I actually sold off about half of my collection. It's great to have all of these different formats, mixes, and iterations together in one convenient and practical package. This includes the original mixes, the Wilson stereo remixes, his instrumental mixes, the 2013 5.1 mixes, and of course the new Atmos mixes. We also have the vinyl record, which is mastered by Bernie Grunman, and we have CDs and Blu-ray formats. I'm the kind of nutcase who owns like 5 different copies of an album like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It's not at all out of character for me to own several formats of the same album and collect different masterings. Having them all conveniently packaged in this beautiful box, along with the extras, such as the outtakes and live recordings, it's not just an aesthetic pleasure, it's insanely practical and it doesn't take up nearly as much room as owning 5 different copies of this album. So while I freely admit that this kind of release style isn't for everyone, like I can't see this being for a casual fan, for somebody like me who works in the music field as a music producer and a mixing and mastering engineer, I find owning these various different formats is actually very beneficial for me. I find that it's something that I can learn from. That being said, I do understand being a little bit burnt out by the repetition that sets like these offer. And they definitely aren't intended to be binged, because I can get to the point where it's like, well, what can I say different about these 5 different versions that I've heard of it? I feel like something like this, you're meant to have in your collection for years and years and just revisit. Every time you're in the mood to hear the album, you might listen to it a little bit different way and get a different impression upon the material. So speaking of the packaging, I do love the booklet included. It's not the most informative thing in the world, but it helps to set the proper context. I do wish we'd have had some notes about the Rainbow Theater show restoration and some of the technical issues, which I will get to, as well as a note from Wilson about the new Dolby Atmos mixes. Would have been really nice. That said, I love the full color pages and what are, to me at least, unseen photographs. Check out the one that kind of looks like King Gizzard might have been inspired by it on their recent record, The Silver Cord. I love it. You may also notice that there's a disc missing from my unboxing footage, and that's actually because I had the disc in the player and I forgot to put it back in. I've of course muted that audio from what you're seeing, so I don't get demonetized or copyright claims. But don't worry and don't yell at me in the comments. My box set is complete, and I was simply enjoying the music as I was recording what you're seeing on screen right now. So to summarize what I've said so far, and before I move on to some criticisms, I really dig these sets. And even though they are flawed, I will continue supporting them. The repeated material does burn me out sometimes, particularly when preparing for a review such as this, but I really don't think these sets are meant to be binged. I admit my desire to own multiple versions is not normal, but I am a mixing and mastering engineer. I find it genuinely beneficial in studying my craft to have these variants on hand. So, on to some of the extras included. Of course, I mentioned how excited I was for Rainbow 72. And it is an excellent show. It's a fantastic show. In fact, I got quite addicted to it and ended up playing it several times over the weekend. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that it does have a couple of problems that could have been sorted out with an extra layer of quality control. For starters, it claims to be the complete Rainbow 72 show, which is my understanding was the soundtrack for the Yes Songs video. However, 2 songs, Heart of the Sunrise and You and I, are not Rainbow Theater performances. They are actually taken from Greensboro, North Carolina, as included on the Progeny and Yes Songs album. Also, there's a really weird dropout in the Close to the Edge title track that drives me nuts. I've never heard anything like this before on an officially released product. It drops out and comes back backwards before being corrected right on a big downbeat. It almost sounds musically intentional, and a part of me thought, maybe I should rip that off somewhere for one of my projects, but I highly doubt it. It sounds to me like it was probably a bad splice, like somebody made an edit into the physical tape and reattached it backwards. And to me, this is one of those things that, had it been an archival release that I was working on, I probably would have made an attempt to fix. But those criticisms aside, the Rainbow December 1972 concert included is absolutely incredible. From a sound/presentation perspective, listeners should expect something along the lines of a Frank Zappa road tape. It's clear, it's mostly balanced, and it sounds great cranked up loud. It's pretty raw and exciting too, which is a nice contrast from the very clean album versions. It's a vintage mix by Eddie Offord, as indicated in the liner notes, and as such, it does have a few problems. Like, it can sometimes sound like the backing vocals are covering up the lead vocals. There are dropouts throughout, which, should be expected from 50-year-old tapes. Like, I'm not going to complain too much, but sometimes it does get a little chaotic sound and you can lose certain instruments. Other times, instruments jump out very jarringly, and it takes a little bit of time getting used to. That being said, the setlist is absolutely amazing. Many of the major compositions from Yes's, in my opinion, 3 best albums are included. Every song from Close to the Edge is here, which is incredible. I have to think, if I heard a Jethro Tull concert from the Thick as a Brick tour like this, at this admittedly sometimes rough but listenable quality, I'd be absolutely losing my mind. And now that I think of it, this isn't Tull, it's Yes, and I'm still losing my mind over it a little bit. It is that good. So for historical context, this Rainbow Theater concert presents a Yes at the slightly post-Bill Bruford stage. So we have John Anderson on vocals, Steve Howe on guitar, Chris Squire on bass, Rick Wakeman on keys, and newcomer Alan White on drums. Alan White isn't simply playing Bruford's parts verbatim, but he's absolutely killing it, and the band sound ferocious. I find Siberian Khatru, which I mentioned is maybe my least favorite track on the original album, absolutely riveting in comparison. It's an absolutely barnstorming concert opener. I've seen All Good People. It's fun and bouncy. Heart of the Sunrise rips, and John Anderson sings his lungs out in a way that I've never heard him before. And You and I is suitably transcendent, and they tear through the album title track like it's already their greatest hit. The I Get Up, I Get Down bridge section is a clear emotional peak. For fun, check out Rick Wakeman quoting Christmas tunes during his Six Wives of Henry VIII solo feature. As this was recorded in December, I imagine that Christmas tunes were in the air, and you can hear the audience laughing and reacting to it. And it's really a lot of fun. And speaking of tearing through their biggest hit, Roundabout and Starship Trooper are great versions. As I mentioned before, I got kind of addicted to this show for a bit, and I couldn't stop playing it. I've been critical before to lots of jamming on some of these older archival releases, but Yes's jamming does not alienate me. I find it rather tasteful and often in service of the song and performances, and I like hearing Hal take slightly different approaches to the phrasing on some passages. It keeps it fresh for me, and I feel like this show included is something that I will return to. So on to some of the rarities included. This is once again a bit of a mixed bag, and there's really not much here that hasn't been released before. Only the Steven Wilson edits of Siberian Khatru, Chord of Life, and Total Mass Retain. And it's interesting to compare these to the vintage single versions, which are included at the front of the disc, because you have to ask yourself, how on earth do you promote an album like this that has no lead singles? Every song on it is well above 4 minutes, with the title track being, 18 minutes, 19 minutes long. So it is kind of an interesting look into how to present this to an unsuspecting audience. However, I'm not sure how much replay value they have for us fans. The elephant in the room with this disc, of course, is the America Dry Mix. This is Yes's cover of the Simon and Garfunkel tune of the same name, and it's actually one of my favorite things they've ever done. I love John Anderson singing on it. It honestly takes me back to the early days of Yes, with like the self-titled album and Time and a Word. It's very clear listening to this dry mix of America that it's a needle drop, and apparently it's not a very good one. It's quite listenable, but it's also a bit dull sounding. It might simply be the age of the pressing, but it almost sounds to my ears like some considerable noise reduction has been applied. Also, some members of Steve Hoffman forums have noticed that Wilson's 2024 mix of America never made it to any of these CDs, but it is an extra on the Fragile Blu-ray. However, I did confirm that box set has an instrumental mix of it. Presumably Wilson's, of course. So what exactly is the deal with this dry mix of America? Fans really want this. It's a shame they can't quite get it right. Are the reverb effects baked into the masters or something? I really wish somebody in the comments would reach out and let me know more about this, because as a newcomer to the band, I'm really not sure, why people want the dry mix and why it can't be recreated digitally. So with the exception of the Steven Wilson edits of Siberian Kotru, Chord of Life, and Total Mass Retain, nothing is new here, which is unfortunate. But there's probably nothing left in the vaults. Still, instead of crying cash grab, I admit I'd be more annoyed if these extras from the previous 2013 edition were not included. And to my estimation, the only thing that hasn't been ported over from that previous edition is the Close to the Edge UK pressing needle drop. So, unless that needle drop is really important to you, I think you can kind of sell that old Panegyric edition and pick this up instead. I'm really not sure what the point of the Wilson included edits are, other than to update the singles to promote this box. This is where, once again, the liner notes come up short. They could be explaining these things to us, justifying choices made. Although I've gotten some trouble for pointing out issues with the liner notes before.
Since you're super fussy and difficult to please, maybe you should email Rhino and request that they have you edit the liner notes for upcoming releases to your personal satisfaction. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to oblige your request. It's all about you.
So moving on to the vinyl LP included. If you're a vinyl purist, I think you will not be disappointed in this pressing. It's of a much thicker stock than my old US copy was from the early 70s. It's probably either 180 or 200 gram. The sound is nicely mastered. It's very punchy, but to my ears, not in the least bit compressed, at least not in an ugly way. I can hear plenty of detail from the higher end percussion sounds to Chris Squire's present and throaty bass guitar. There's nary a click or pop in earshot, and no detectable sibilance, which can be problematic on higher voices like John Anderson's. Instruments and vocal harmonies sound natural. Bill Bruford's drums have heft and power. I'm admittedly not much of a vinyl guy, but Bernie Grundmann's mastering here is better to my ears than the Fragile issue from last year. And despite being a mostly digital guy, of course, I really don't mind listening to the album this way. It's very warm sounding and inviting. By contrast, the Bernie Grundmann 2025 master on the CD sounds just a little bit loud compared to the LP. And I think I like the sound of the vinyl better. It's probably not going to be an issue for most people. It's not brick-walled, but I would say that the 2025 Grundmann remaster included on the Blu-ray is the best of both worlds. It's quieter than the CD, and it sounds at least as good as the LP to me. Maybe even a little bit better. Of course, the instrumental mixes included offer further insights into the recording, and may even potentially feature instrumental parts that were unused. It could also be that they are simply obscured by the vocals, but I give these instrumental mixes a thumbs up. I didn't spend a whole lot of time on them, so I can't tell you more details than that, but I could see me killing a rainy afternoon flipping through the different mixes included on the Blu-ray. Now, on to the 5.1 mixes, which, as I mentioned before, really made me love this album. And I'm kind of surprised to report that compared to the new Atmos mixes, I find that the 2013 5.1 mixes have a certain plastic quality to them. And that seems to be removed entirely for the Atmos mixes. The Atmos mixes sound vintage and warm. It's truly a remarkable thing for your ears. It's completely uncompressed sounding, and it's dynamic. The 5.1 mixes, I noticed, are also quite a bit louder and border on shrillness by comparison. This is incredible to me, because for years I felt that the 2013 5.1 mix of this album was the gold standard. But in my opinion, Wilson has outdone himself once again. For instance, check out the backwards effects, moving from back to front in Total Mass Retain, or how the church organ overwhelms your room and I Get Up, I Get Down. In various movements of the title track, the voices seem to be commanding from high above the heavens, and the mellotrons seem to be at ear level. It's the mix you know and love, but it's exaggerated to 3 dimensions. It must be heard to be believed. Siberian Katra is by far the most active of the new mixes. Steve Howe's guitar is constantly strolling around your room at different points of the song. The river running right on over my head vocal goes straight for your height speakers. Because of course it does. The outro has all of the instruments trading places with each other and swimming back and forth across the room. It's one of the absolute most complex things I've heard in this format. Steve Wilson paints your ceilings and walls with Yes. It's big, it's open. It's probably the best this album has ever sounded. So now on to the recommendation. Do I recommend this box set to you? And that very much depends on you. If you're happy with the 2013 Panegyric Steven Wilson CD and Blu-ray version, and you don't have an Atmos setup, you might be okay sticking to that old version. I don't know if there's really anything new here for you. However, if you do have an Atmos system, and especially if you don't already have that old mix, I think it is an essential purchase. I might wait until it goes on sale, because it seems like these box sets might get slashed 50% of the list price within 6 months or so. So I might hold out, particularly given the repetition of the material and the fact that aside from the Rainbow Theater show, there's really not a whole lot new here. So in other words, only get this if you're Atmos capable, and of course, if you're interested in the Rainbow Theater show. Otherwise, not everything's for everyone, and that's okay. What bothers me about a lot of these releases when they come out is when people who feel like they don't need it feel the need to announce that nobody should have it and use those incredibly reductive phrases like cash grab. That really frustrates me, especially as somebody who loves these sets and finds them very beneficial and useful to own. So that was my review of the Super Deluxe Edition of Close to the Edge from Yes. Let me know your thoughts. Do you plan to pick it up? But remember to be respectful. I am a human being, not an algorithm. I have feelings, and I'm trying my best here. I may not know every single fact about Yes, but I've tried my best to assemble an informed opinion. So let me know yours in the comments. And don't forget that if you want to see more reviews from me, such as Steven Wilson's The Overview, which should have been here today and very frustratingly is stuck in transit, subscribe to the channel because I will be reviewing it within a week's time. I will also be continuing my ranking of the Rush studio records with my friend Mike, and part 3 of that is due to come out Friday. So if you want to keep an eye on my activities, the only way to do that is to subscribe to the channel. All right, it's been real fun talking to you. Once again, my name's Ian, and you'll hear from me real soon. Bye-bye.